Good afternoon. Welcome to INSA's 2021 Spring Symposium, OSINT, Think Outside of the Skiff. Before we begin, we'd like to share a video from our sponsor, BAE.
We accelerate intelligence and cybersecurity solutions, from integrating secure clouds to delivering data-driven analytics to operational mission support. The work we do helps inform decisions, mitigate risk, and support evolving missions. Together, we empower those that make the kind of decisions that make it possible for all of us to live life to the fullest. This is why I believe in BAE Systems Intelligence and Security.
Please welcome INSA President, Suzanne Wilson-Heckenberg.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for INSA's Spring Symposium. This year's event is focusing on open source intelligence, which has come a long way since the days when the IC's principal source of OSINT was translations of foreign media reports by the Foreign Broadcast Information Service. As intelligence leaders have often noted, the intelligence community is awash in information, foreign media, social media, commercially available databases, company information, technical journals, and much, much more. As such, information can be sliced, diced, combined, and analyzed in any number of ways thanks to new and emerging technologies for acquiring, compiling, sorting, and analyzing this information. The IC and the Defense Department partner closely with industry to develop technologies that can ingest and interpret this data quickly and at scale, including all types of robotic process automation and many others. The rapid pace of innovation is changing the way information can be used, whether by an analyst in Langley or an Army platoon in the field. However, open source data has become available in such quantities and over such a period of time that the intelligence community is still figuring out how to use it effectively despite these technological advances. Over the next 2 days, we have a terrific lineup of thought leaders, pioneers, and subject matter experts who are ready to share their insights and ideas on policy, tradecraft, technology, and challenges related to OSINT. We will delve into how intelligence agencies, the military, and industry are positioned to maximize the value of open source information. But before we get started, a couple of housekeeping items. First, we hope to make today's program as interactive as possible. We have over 800 registrants, so please submit your questions through the Q&A box on the right side of the screen. Feel free to include your name and your organization, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. We welcome members of the press today. As a reminder, today's program is on the record and will be available on our website early next week. And finally, and very importantly, I would like to thank our generous sponsors: A1C Partners, BAE Systems, Cobweb, GDIT, Mantech, Peraton, Raytheon Intelligence and Space, SAIC, TransUnion, and TRSS for their vital support of today's program. We could not deliver this type of quality content without them as our sponsor partners. Now, to introduce our keynote speaker, I am pleased to welcome Stephen Homeyer, Vice President, Intelligence Strategy and Head of the Space Intelligence Business Unit for BAE Systems. Stephen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Suzanne. But I'd also like to thank INSA for hosting this program and for the tremendous work they do producing these vital policy discussions. BAE Systems is a proud supporter of INSA. Our intelligence and security sector provides large-scale system engineering, integration, and sustainment services across domains. We're currently the prime contractor on the U.S. Army's OSINT program, where we conduct and synchronize multidisciplinary OSINT and security operations and deliver linguists, training, and acquisition support. Our OSINT toolkit capability processes data from more than 10,000 distinct platforms and millions of unique data feeds from worldwide systems. We've trained over 500 analysts in the past year alone on our INSA program. Like many of our intelligence comrades, we dedicate our professional lives to solving complex problems and driving innovation where it counts. BAE Systems will continue to be a strong member and a contributor to this outstanding community of professionals. Now it's my privilege to introduce today's speaker. The Honorable John E. McLaughlin spent more than 30 years at the CIA, rising to positions of Vice Chair for Estimates, Acting Chair for the National Intelligence Council, Deputy Director for Intelligence, Deputy Director for the agency, before becoming Acting Director in 2004. While serving as Deputy Director for Intelligence, he created the Senior Analytics Service and the Sherman Kent School for Intelligence Analysis, an institution for teaching history, mission, and essential skills of analysis to CIA employees. Recently, Mr. McLaughlin served on the CSIS Technology and Intelligence Task Force that set out to understand the impact of emerging technologies in the IC. In January, the task force released its final report entitled Maintaining the Intelligence Edge, Reimagining and Reinventing Intelligence Through Innovation, which, amongst its many findings, noted that the primary obstacle to intelligence innovation is not technology, it's culture. The report also found that while skepticism of OSINT persists, the IC must fundamentally reconceptualize OSINT as a cornerstone of US intelligence, relevant across the IC enterprise and in all aspects of current and future missions. A graduate of the US Army Infantry Officer Candidate School at Fort Benning, Mr. McLaughlin was recently inducted into the school's Hall of Fame. He is currently a distinguished practitioner in residence at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. Following his opening remarks, Fran Moore, former CIA Director of Intelligence and current Senior Intelligence Advisor for the Analysis and Resilience Center, will lead the moderated question and answer session. Now, please welcome the Honorable John McLaughlin.
Thank you, Stephen, for that very generous introduction. It's great to be here. Good afternoon to everyone. And as your keynoter, I'm going to throw some ideas out there for you to think about in the course of this wonderful conference. I'm going to talk to you for about 15 minutes, and then we will go to questions. And let me begin today by telling you a story from my very early days in the intelligence world. I started at CIA in the mid-1970s as an analyst of communism in Southern Europe. And that was actually a hot intelligence issue, if you can believe it. I had done graduate work in that area. I had a couple of the languages, and I was accustomed to reading what might be called the quality press from that region. But in Washington, the best I could do was some fragmentary reporting from the Foreign Broadcast Information Service, FBIS, that Suzanne mentioned a moment ago, which seldom touched the things that I was interested in. And I knew that newspapers overseas, the ones I had been reading a few years before, had the 1970s equivalents of reporters we think of today, like David Sanger or David Ignatius. In other words, people with contacts in local governments over there, who were often the recipients of sensitive information that I wasn't seeing and that I never saw in classified channels. So believe it or not, back then, the only way I could access a lot of that information was by having CIA stations actually pouch me, that is by diplomatic pouch, newspapers from the area, a process that took about 2 weeks to bring those dried out and yellowing pages to my desk at CIA. My point here is that there's really nothing new about open source. It's just easier to get, and the volume has exploded. But even 25 years ago, I always told officers working for me that their job was to know everything publicly available about the subjects they were responsible for. That was the starting point. They were to focus on that before they paid a lot of attention to classified information. Now, unlike my struggles 25, 40 years ago, open source is now in your face 24 hours a day, buzzing in your purse or pocket on those little computers we all carry around, and coming at you through online research sites, cable TV, social media, and various news aggregators, 24 hours a day. So what was once a trickle has turned into an avalanche. And there's a lot of essential stuff in there. There's also a lot of junk, and I'll come back to that. Now, in telling you my old story, I risk suggesting that my acquaintance with open source is dated, but nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, I speak to you today as a real, live, current, practicing open source analyst. That's where I'm coming from. Since leaving the government, I've kept my clearances, but frankly, I use them only when called upon by the government to review something. Otherwise, I rely on open sources, especially for a foreign affairs column that I've been writing and publishing every 2 to 3 weeks since 2013 on subjects ranging from Russian politics to the technical aspects of North Korean and Iranian missiles and nuclear weapons. Something on the latter subject is coming out later this week. So I'm not just an observer, I'm speaking to you as a real live user, one who is increasingly astonished, the longer I'm out of government, astonished at what is available and what can be learned without drawing at all on classified information. But let's pause here to ask ourselves, what are we actually talking about? In the intelligence field, when we invent an acronym like OSINT, we tend to toss it around as though it means the same thing to everyone. In fact, I think you will discover in this conference that the term conjures up very different images among different people. Now, you may disagree with my definition of OSINT, but as your keynoter, I'm putting some ideas out there for you to chew on and possibly disagree with as you unpack all the aspects of this subject over the next 2 days. So what is OSINT, open source material? What is OSINT and who needs it? I think it comes in at least 5 flavors. First, there is raw news, the stuff that is fire hosing you all day long with so-called breaking news and alerts. Here, the task of the OSINT officer, the open source officer, the task is epistemological. That is, determining what to actually believe, what is true. When I briefed some new members of Congress, a group of new members of Congress, after the 2018 midterm elections, the most frequent question I got was, how are we supposed to know what's true? As a friend of mine says, the subjectivity of truth is the crisis of our time. I'm going to say that again. The subjectivity of truth is the crisis of our time. Second variety of OSINT is also information that blends this, what I've just been talking about, raw information, blends this and other data with interpretation, commentary, and analysis. Essentially, this is the finished intelligence of the open source world. Third, there is what I would call basic and applied research, the kind of material that yields new scientific and technical data bearing on national security issues. And it comes from social science institutes, technical institutes, scientific institutes, and from universities. Strikingly, this often features commercial imagery from space and less advanced open source SIGINT, such as RF spectrum monitoring and maritime domain awareness. And I'm going to give you an example of both of those in just a moment. So number four, there is the exploding world of social media. Thinking first of the publicly transparent forums such as Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, you know the list. But then how should we think about their media cousins like messaging apps that are not classified but are deeply encrypted, such as Signal or WhatsApp? Do they belong here? That's a question I'll leave with you. Fifth, and finally, there's the growing Internet of Things, with somewhere around 30 billion internet-connected devices, refrigerators, baby monitors, farm tractors, thermostats, coffee pots, and the omnipresent CCTV, all with varying levels of mostly inadequate security. Like messaging apps, these are not all publicly transparent, but they are also not classified exactly in the sense that the IC uses that term. Should they be in the open source universe? Or is this more in the NSA or FBI bailiwick? The thing I'm certain of is that this is an intelligence target, both for adversaries and for us. The question is it open source? Is it on the line? Where is it? I leave that for you to think about. So those are 5 varieties of open source, and you may think of others. But now, who needs these sources of information? Curated. And where should they go? I think just about everyone in the IC needs them, whether operational, analytical, technical, or support. And intelligence customers who need some assurance, I think, that that kind of material is either being presented to them and so labeled, or is integrated responsibly into material they receive that is also classified. Now, is this the sort of fad that will just pass, like many things that pop up in the intelligence world? No, because we're in the midst of an ongoing technology revolution, broader in scope, speed, and impact than anything in modern history. And it's nowhere close to over. The symptom we are concerned with here is the exponential growth of volume and variety in the creation of information. It's driven at bottom by the miniaturization of circuitry. It took 400 years to go from the printing press to the telegraph, but it only took 30 years to go from no smartphones in the world to over 3 billion. That's very symptomatic of this revolution. Also, in 1988, the average microprocessor contained 275,000 transistors. The latest iPhone has close to 12 billion. Now, scientists debate whether Moore's law, which is what this is all about, will eventually collapse when miniaturization reaches the atomic level. But we're not there yet. And so the scientific drivers of this revolution that I've described, they still have plenty of gas. Add artificial intelligence and machine learning into this mix, and there's no mystery why we are now debating the issue of whether OSINT is a separate and distinct intelligence discipline. Now, apart from dealing with the sheer volume of open source, what are the challenges that it presents to the intelligence world? I see at least 4. First, the proliferation, the growth of open source creates stiff competition for the intelligence community. Let me read you a quote that you never want to hear as an intelligence officer. This is Winston Churchill in September 1944, responding to a report from the UK's Joint Intelligence Committee, the JIC, that still exists and that many of you have dealt with. Churchill in 1944. This is what he said. I have now read the JIC's report, and I have not noticed any fact in it of which I was not already aware. You never want to hear that. The availability of quality open source means the IC must be careful not to stumble into that situation. And I would cite North Korea as exhibit number 1. I could give you many examples, but do you know that the New York Times now has something called a Visual Investigations Unit that teamed up with US and British think tanks and used a combination of commercial imagery, ship tracking SIGINT, document exploitation, and my favorite innovation in all of this, commissioned cinematography to accurately track illicit sanctions-busting oil deliveries to North Korea. They paired their written report with a sophisticated video brandishing all of these sources. And I swear it looks exactly like something CIA would have produced. I'm going to give links to these to the conference organizers, and they can make them available to you along with whatever else they're putting in the chat or the repository of things you can access. Just as examples, not endorsing them or endorsing a particular newspaper, but just saying these are examples of what can be done with open source. And separately, I know from my own work that it's possible to get credible data on missile testing, range equivalence estimates, nuclear stockpiles, and weapons arsenals on both North Korea and Iran. And imagine, we always called North Korea the most opaque intelligence target in the world. And tomorrow, Thursday, on the DNI website, you can see evidence that the IC is quite capable of producing data-rich strategic intelligence without resort to classified information. I'm referring to the National Intelligence Council's Global Trends 2040 paper, for which I was privileged to be an outside reader. I think you will like it, and you will learn a lot from it. On the DNI website tomorrow. That's challenge number 1. Second, this phenomenon will push the IC, or ought to push it, to focus its costly collection sources more narrowly on what we've always called the hard targets. You can put that in quotes for those of you who worked in the profession. The things that open source seldom yields. These tend to center on leadership intentions in the most inaccessible and adversarial countries in the world, rather than on their capabilities, which are generally easier to discern. This will probably mandate quality over quantity in classified reporting, and that will require strong leadership, cultural change, and this is important, constructive oversight in the Congress. Third challenge. These are particularly acute challenges at this exact moment, because we have, as I see it, the first administration whose professional lives have been soaked in open source material. I know earlier administrations have been exposed to it too, but there is a certain rhythm to the arrival and maturation and curating of open source material in the last several years. And this administration is staffed by people who've just grown up and lived in that world. So leaving politics aside, I believe it's fair to say we now have an array of national security leaders who are competent, deeply experienced, and who have kept up. That is to say, largely through conferences like this, quality open source material, things they've written based on open source. And they've only been out of government 4 years. This is unlike recent administrations staffed by people who've been away from government for 8 years or longer, and whose experience in national security was less direct or fresh. In other words, the bar to impress right now is higher than normal for intelligence. A final challenge, number 4, and you're going to think of other ones, but I'm at number 4. Full-blown exploitation of open source is likely to take the IC once again into the thicket of civil liberties and legal issues. In my own experience, I have learned that in the IC, this can be what I call frontier law. That is, benefiting from few precedents and stirring certain controversy, whatever the ruling, on issues of a legal nature in the intelligence business. This is already starting, as we see in the alarm of civil liberties groups, the alarm they have expressed about the techniques of facial recognition and video exploitation used by law enforcement to identify and arrest some of the perpetrators of the January 6th insurrection. Open source causing political controversy and legal controversy. Now, to close this off, let me remind you that the task force I was part of at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, looking at technology and intelligence, did include a section on open source. Among our conclusions, we thought it made sense to move or modify the existing open source center, now housed in the CIA's digital directory. But we didn't come up with any agreement or consensus on where to put it. Now, I hesitate to raise organizational issues because they tend to take over discussion, and particularly if they tend to take over discussion and they can create a false sense of having solved something. For me, organization has always been the solution of last resort. The problem, the nub of the problem is usually somewhere else. But in any event, I will mention we had 3 options. The first was to create an 18th IC agency, a new agency dedicated to open source. The second was to move the open source center into the State Department on the theory that it would be easier to carry out liaison with producers of open source information from a platform that was itself less dependent on classified information. And third, move it under the DNI, the Director of National Intelligence, with the mission of serving the whole IC from a central hub. That's my personal favorite. But again, I urge you not to get hung up on these organizational options, but to focus subsequent discussion in this conference on the earlier issues I've mentioned. So my aim has been to give you plenty to debate in the hours ahead to at least kick off the discussion. So go for it. And now I'm happy to take any questions, and I think Fran Moore is our moderator for this. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, John. Thank you for your insights on open source intelligence and for providing your perspective on the CSIS Technology and Intelligence Task Force report. And I'm really delighted to moderate your discussion with the audience today. I kind of want to go back to your role on the task force a little bit, and also just as you did in your remarks, draw on your long career in intelligence in terms of the role that OSINT could or should play in terms of strengthening the IC, but specifically in maintaining an edge over our adversaries. You alluded to precious resources and collection dedicated to those hard targets. But the real question is, what is the advantage in terms of open source on countries like Russia, China, North Korea? You mentioned the New York Times, model on North Korea, I think is a really good example of good work that can be done in open source. But are there advances in sentiment analysis, advances in content analysis, AI enabled, that actually might get to leadership and intentions kinds of questions in those hard targets? So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the kinds of applications in open source that either have experienced or in the task force you discussed could really crack some of those hard target collection gaps.
Well, I think, Fran, that open source is not as helpful on things like leadership intentions as it is on capabilities. And on capabilities, though, I think it makes an enormous contribution. And how does that happen? It happens in large part because information that's in the hands of researchers and scientists who look at things like commercial imagery, that their analysis of those things is now readily available. Whereas if you went back 20, 25 years, someone like Sig Hecker out at Stanford, who is an expert really on enrichment techniques in North Korea for uranium enrichment, has actually been there and seen the centrifuge setup. He might have thought about that and talked about it 25 years ago, but it wouldn't be as easily available as it is today. Surprisingly to me, I mean, maybe some people in the audience would disagree, but I find even Twitter is a source for quality information if you know how to look for it. If you happen to be following the right people, they tend to put a link on Twitter to their most recent information or their most recent assessments. So when I said in my remarks that I think I've been able to come up with credible data on things like North Korean missile testing, I'm looking mainly at information that comes out of a website like 38 North, or information that comes out of the Institute for, forget exactly how the acronym translates, but it's David Albright's Institute in Washington. So I think I can say with some confidence that the last test that North Korea did of the Hwasong 15 in 2017 went up into the air 2,800 miles. And that if you flattened out that trajectory or turned it into a normal trajectory, it could go 13,000 miles and probably get to the 1,000 miles and probably get to the United States.
Sure.
So I'm assuming that's correct. Now, someone in the intelligence world may tell me it's not, but I suspect that's about right. And that's all from open source. Now, on intentions, I go to a lot of conferences and I hear experts talk about Russian intentions. For example, recently, what are Russian policies toward Belarus and toward the future of Alexei Navalny, the dissident who's currently in prison in Russia. And everyone has a view, and some of those views are well informed. If you go to a conference with a member of Navalny's group, you can probably infer that you're getting credible information on the intentions of that group and an insight into what government policy might be. But I don't think you have the same assurance as you do on capabilities. So I think that's a frontier we have to work. And it may be that artificial intelligence can be useful in breaking through that frontier on intentions. I've gone on a little too long, but that was a complicated question.
No, it was a great answer. And I just want to follow up a little bit because, again, I'm going back to your example in the New York Times. There was clearly an integration of technology, expertise, comfort with bringing different disparate data streams together to draw those conclusions and to produce that insight. I know that you've been out, but you work very closely back in and you send your students back into the IC. The environment in the intelligence community, do you think there's enough agility to be comfortable fully exploiting open source, using that kind of multi-stream data to actually draw those conclusions and then take the next step, right, which is fuse it with what they're collecting from a clandestine perspective? It gets a little bit to the culture issue, and I'm going to hit that one head on in a minute, but You know, inside of that, the insular nature of the IC, are they agile enough to actually use technology to do this work and then fuse it with what's clandestinely collected?
There's probably some work to be done on that score. And I'm always a little hesitant because you and I have talked about this once before. I find
Right.
if you're not actually in an agency walking the halls and talking to people and
Right.
I'm humble enough to think I don't fully understand exactly
Right.
what's going on, even though, of course, you know, people like you and myself have an instinct for it. My sense is that it was always the case when I was in the field, and I suspect it still is, that classified information is king. In other words, the preference is to work from classified information. There's a sense that classified information is somehow special. In fact, when I send, as I must, my columns and other writings to the Publications Review Board, I always elaborately footnote unclassified information, like the data I just mentioned on North Korea, because I'm not sure they know what's unclassified.
Yes.
And if it looks interesting, there's an assumption in the intelligence profession that this must be classified.
Right.
Well, actually, no. This was figured out by some scientists at Stanford or the Monterey Institute for Proliferation Studies. So I think that there is an insular quality to the intelligence world that binds you together over this classified information. Now, again, I don't know whether you would agree, but I find the very best, just thinking of analysts, analysts tended to be pretty smart about what was publicly available in their area and integrating that into their work. The very best case officers were always attuned to what was going on publicly before they went through the recruitment cycle to figure out who they needed to get as an agent. But I think there's probably a ways to go on this.
Thank you. So I'm going to take a question. We've got some questions now from the audience. There's a question regarding OSINT as it applies to and augments everyday intelligence disciplines, human and GeoInt. And the question is really, how should the IC view OSINT in the 21st century? It gets a little bit to your questions, you know, not just organizationally, should it be its own organization or not, but should it merge with every discipline? So in other words, should every analyst be responsible for OSINT, or should it be an umbrella over other disciplines and be sort of a driver collection? What role should OSINT play as it relates to driving collection? And then in terms of the use of it, is it every analyst's responsibility, or should there be a specialization in an OSINT agency?
Well, isn't that the question? And I think what you're getting to with that question is, how would this actually work? And the way I'm going to think out loud here for a minute, because the way I would see it working is this. Every analyst, every case officer, every person in the S&T arena should be very literate about what is available publicly in their area. Chances are there's more than they can deal with. And so that could be supplemented by open source officers who are uniquely focused on that source of data, just as an NSA officer is, in a sense, all source, but focused uniquely on the SIGINT that's coming in. So an NSA officer is always going to know more about what is going on in the communications patterns of country X than I am, even if I'm working on country X as an all-source analyst or as a case officer. So I see the open source specialist. Let's not call them analysts. Let's say the open source specialist as someone. Let's come up with an example. An open source specialist on I'm hesitant to name a real country, but I'll make up a favorite country for academic purposes is Albonia, okay? And say an open source specialist focused on Albonia should be absorbing all of the information about it in a sophisticated way. That is knowing, going back to my question of what's true, you need to know a lot about the subject in order to use open source information smartly, in order to pick your way through the junk and figure out, oh no, that point of view, that has credibility for the following reasons. Or, oh, that data, we have never seen information on that particular accelerometer before. That's something that stabilizes a missile. That's new. This is a little bit like the role of a CMO, a collection management officer.
Yes.
So the open source specialist is that person who is on top of all of that stuff on Albonia and, you know, sorting through it. Now, maybe the Albonian analyst and case officer is also doing that, but sure enough, the person who's doing that full time on open source is going to come up and say, have you seen this? And chances are they will not have seen that. And so that's kind of how I see this working.
So I think what I just heard you describe is that the open source int as an identity, as an int, needs to really be knowledgeable about everything that is exploitable, openly available, however you define that, to include those gray areas like, you know, message apps, et cetera. Is that really open source or not? But it sounds like you're saying also it's incumbent on the part of all collectors, all analysts, in IC entities to fully understand what open source int can do for them and to have that relationship back with the OSINT collector or OSINT analyst to make sure that they're making the maximum use of what that int is available, regardless of how the int is organized. I mean, you said you saw it as as best handled in the DNI, but the DNI is not deep in infrastructure, so maybe it'd be interesting to hear you talk a little bit more about what a DNI directly led rather than the functional. I think they have a functional manager relationship with the agency now. What would a DNI run OSINT entity look like?
Did I hear that correctly? What does a DNI run OSINT entity look like? Yeah.
And what's the value of that versus where it's sitting now?
Well, look, let me go back to my remarks and say I think any of the organizational constructs we've come up with can work. It is a matter of leadership. You could leave it in the CIA, for that matter, in the digital directorate. That was not the sentiment broadly of the task force, but you could leave it there if the CIA truly embraced the idea of being the agent for the whole community on this, and took that on. And there is a tradition there, of course, of serving the whole community. If you put it in the DNI, I think you maybe have a somewhat greater possibility of serving all customers equally, because the DNI, of course, coordinates and oversees the activities of all 16 other agencies. And the question is, and here we can go down the rabbit hole of organization, but the question is, what is it you put there? Do you put the existing center there? Do you put a coordinating staff there with outlying bodies of open source specialists in all of the agencies, and the way the National Counterproliferation Center is set up? Or is it more like the National Counterterrorism Center, which is a body of people uniquely devoted to?
Right.
And I think I would lean toward the latter. And I think any open source entity you create is likely to grow. It's likely to grow because the data is likely to grow. And just a matter of time before whoever's doing it or running it will say, you know, I'm at the red line here.
Right.
I have more trouble envisioning a separate agency, but there were members of our task force who advocated for that.
Right.
Presenting them fairly. I mean, that was all points of view were represented. And we
Right.
decided not to settle that, but to actually recommend that the DNI
The DNI study it.
figure that out, which is, something good for the DNI to do.
Well, you're now getting quite a few questions, so let me give you some of the audience flavor for what folks are interested in. One of the questions gets back to the technology question, in giving the task force focus on technology. What tools and capabilities have you seen in play, or did the task force identify that really open that opportunity to close intelligence gaps? You walked through sort of the 5 flavors of OSINT, and some of those are more in the technical realm, but was there something there that sort of excited you in terms of technology's ability to discern the veracity of, right, and deliver information that really enable IC analysts? And several questions with that variation in flavor, so I think that pretty much captures it.
Yeah, well, of course, when we're talking about the 2 key technologies here, it's important to emphasize that the intelligence world has always thrived on technology.
Mm-hmm.
Until the invention of the telegraph in the mid-19th century, it was all about HUMINT and opening mail and stuff like that. From the mid-19th century forward, it's been a steady progression toward integrating technology into the work, starting with radio and then telephones and then SIGINT, and now we're all the way at the other end on network exploitation. But fundamentally, until in the last century, technology was about physics and engineering, things like atomic weapons and air travel and so forth. Now, that's all still there, of course, and important, but now the technological revolutions are occurring in things like information technology, biology, nanotechnology, and the integration of all of these. And the ones that jump out with the greatest immediate application for this profession are artificial intelligence and machine learning.
Right.
And if you think back to the discipline that you were primarily in, analysis, analysis in the end is all about finding and fusing data.
Right.
That's what it's about.
Right.
And the data volume is constantly growing. So these 2 techniques, artificial intelligence, but really machine learning, which is, of course, powered by artificial intelligence, can help with searching, fusing data and visualization. I did a study for the DNI about 10 years ago, looking back at a near successful terrorist attack that you will recall.
I do remember. I was on the other side of the table.
Yeah, it was the 2009 Christmas bomber.
Yes, yes.
The first intelligence surprise of the Obama administration. And we concluded that, if analysts had found the 12 or 15 reports and had them all lined up on a table and read them sequentially, they probably would have seen this coming. But they were buried in literally thousands of reports that were more than anyone could absorb in a conventional way. And our recommendation was, and I know the community has progressed on this, but I can't tell you to what degree, is that we needed tools that would allow. Now, I had a person on my team from Google, a Google scientist, who said what you need are tools that allow data to talk to data. In other words,
right.
In the most colloquial sense, when you order something from Amazon and it says you might also be interested in,
right,
your 5 things. In the intelligence world, this is what artificial intelligence and machine learning, among other things, can help you do. Oh, you're interested in this report? Well, here are 5 others dating back over the last 10 years that seem to form a pattern with that. Now, there are tools now that help people do that, but there's more that can be done, I'm sure.
Sure.
You can test analytic judgments against big data. In other words, you've come to a conclusion, but there's this body of data out there that may include more bytes than anyone can handle except with a Cray computer. But these techniques can say, thinking back to my methodology training and remembering factor analysis, are there thematics in here that are only apparent when you run the algorithms? And if they are, do they coincide with the conclusions we've come to?
Right.
You're always wondering whether there's something you're missing. This can help you answer that. So those are some of the things that you can look to these techniques to do. And in technical collection, you can zoom through. I don't know whether I'm sure there are people in the audience who are either on this task force or who have specific expertise. Robert Cardillo was on our task force, for example. I remember Robert talking about what you can do in the imagery world to help you with image recognition and categorization at higher speed than we typically have done. You can, with machine learning, you can process and exploit ELINT data, for example.
Right.
At a higher level of efficiency. So now some of this is being done, some of it is in pilots, some of it, as you know, the way intelligence community typically works is that most agencies have something underway on all of these things.
Right.
But what is really required is a community-wide focus on integrating these into our processes, in part because our adversaries are doing that, and our adversaries have some advantages. One is their decision process, which is pretty unitary. They don't have a divided government like we do. They don't have 16 agencies like we do. And particularly in the case of China, they have essentially a fusion between their private sector and public sector.
Right.
Unlike us. So, and in the case of China, just by virtue of the size of its population, they have the capacity to generate and collect data, not only there, but through their worldwide operations, which give them an N, to use the term that the scientists use, that is extraordinarily high. And that is what you need as essentially you need a large data set in order to power artificial intelligence and to test and refine machine learning. Now, I'm not a technical person, but I think that is.
No, but you captured it very, very well.
I think that's the conceptual way to think about it.
So John, actually your answer touched on, we've got 2 or 3 questions that are variations on our adversaries have an advantage for the reasons that you laid out. It sort of come down to, we are a transparent society. Does that make us more vulnerable to our adversaries than possibly we can be for all of the sort of rule of law reasons that things we don't do that they can do? And then sort of, but moving beyond that, are there things that we can learn from what they do, that would make it easier for the U.S.? And one of the examples that the audience has given is, should the U.S. continue to pursue a clean net that builds a similarly protected internet? So in other words, China has walled off its internet to some degree. Is there something like that we need to do in the U.S.? I think there's a lot of interest in our adversaries maybe have an advantage. What should we learn from that? And are there things that we either can do within existing authorities, or do we need new authorities to do some of these things? And was that part of the task force discussion?
That was not part of the task force discussion, but just if I could offer a thought on it. I personally, and all of this stuff is so controversial, you should have some discussions in this group. But personally, I hesitate to endorse anything that starts to indicate or suggest decoupling from the global network, information network or internet, whatever you want to call it, in part because I don't think over time China will be able to do this successfully and in a way that sustains the kind of growth in both economy and influence that they seek. And also, the answer to that question is mostly bound up in the larger debate about what is our China policy and what should the center of gravity be in China policy. Is China an enemy, an adversary, a competitor, potential partner, all of these things? And where do you want to put the emphasis? And that's all being sorted out in the government. I'm sure there are different views, and it's politically explosive as well. I think that the main, there are many advantages that their autocratic systems give them. One of them is that for our clandestine operators, if you're an American, it's harder and harder to maintain clandestinity because of our open society and the fact that, you know, most of us are on LinkedIn or Facebook or something. And if you are, well, that's an easy thing to study. And most of us operate somewhere in social media on the internet. That exposes you. If you don't do any of those things, then that makes you look weird. Whereas in those societies, because of what your questioner asked, that is, they do exercise some control over social media and the internet, they can maintain clandestinity with greater ease and in a more traditional way than we do, which I think forces our operations people into seeking innovative solutions to work through that. And I know they are, and I'm not going to talk about that. But I haven't answered your question directly, except I would be hesitant to adopt the kind of things that these societies have adopted, because in the end, I think openness and transparency will be the winner.
Sure. So John, I think this is our last question. I've got several of the audience asking for your view on whether open source and exploitation of open source offers more opportunity for remote working for IC employees. Several of the audience have noted that during the pandemic, some of the IC entities were very effective at actually keeping their workforce employed, doing really important work remotely from home because of their what they had developed already on exploiting open source. And I think the audience would like to, given your career, but also what you've seen outside of your career and what's available in open source, do you believe that it offers remote work opportunities, if not time, part-time, or for on certain topics for the IC?
The short answer is yes, absolutely. But I want to elaborate a little bit because that's such a wonderful question. It opens up a lot of other things. One of the things that open source can, I think, be used imaginatively to help solve is the clearance problem. By that I mean it takes, and of course I teach graduate students now, so some of them apply for, not all of them, but some minority of them apply to work in this field. And I see how long and painful the clearance process is. And I know that the intelligence community has been working hard to shorten that. And I know they've had some success, but it's still very long and painful, and for bad reasons and good. Leaving aside the bad reasons, the good reasons are that, yeah, there is a counterintelligence issue out there that you have to be careful about. And I think on some cases where you've got a close call, someone you really want to hire, but you're not quite there yet on the clearance, you can give that person open source work to do for 6 months or a year while you figure it out. And in the process of that, get a look at them rather than having them sitting off to the side, suffering in silence. And maybe you learn that some of your misgivings are misplaced, or maybe they're legitimate. So, you know, this open source work can be used for multiple innovative things, I believe. And I encourage the intelligence community to do that. Think about it.
Thank you, John.
You are welcome, and it's always great to see you, Fran.
You too.
And I just want to
You
thank
could have answered
both.
all these questions. You were a great moderator.
Strong choice. I just want to thank you both for being with us this afternoon. You've really done a great job of setting the stage for the rest of the conversation today as well as tomorrow. And I think a testament to that is several folks have already reached out to the INSA team asking if this is being recorded and when they can rewatch it. So to me, that is a sign of success. It's now my pleasure to introduce John Fant, who is the Vice President for Space and Intelligence at Peraton and a sponsor of today's program. And John is going to be introducing the moderator for our next panel. So John, I will turn it over to you, and it's so good to see you this afternoon.
Yeah, great to see you as well too, Suzanne. Thank you so much, and good afternoon to everybody who's joining on the call today. On behalf of Peraton, we're honored to continue our longstanding partnership with INSA as a Patriot sponsor for this year's Spring Symposium. As a leading provider of mission-critical operations, management, and engineering services in support of the intelligence community, Peraton recognizes very clearly that solving large, complex problems of today's national security challenges cannot really be achieved by one person, one government, or one company alone. Effective, sustainable solutions do require a diverse combination of people, organizations, ideas, and approaches. INSA's Spring Symposium today continues to be a valuable forum to discuss the latest national security issues and trends in the IC with thought leaders from across government, industry, and academia. Conversations like these introduce new approaches that allow us to evolve and develop solutions that enable us to achieve the national security strategic and tactical advantages that we need over our adversaries for the future. Our thanks to Suzanne and the entire INSA organization for putting on such a great event today and for tomorrow. With that in mind, our next panel is the OSINT Advantage, Reimagining Policy and Culture, and I'm pleased to introduce to you our moderator, the Honorable Ellen McCarthy. Ellen served as the Assistant Secretary of State for Intelligence and Research from 2019 to 2021, leading the bureau responsible for providing all-source intelligence and analysis to support U.S. diplomats. Ellen previously served as president of Nobles NSP and held senior leadership roles at NGA, the Department of Defense, U.S. Coast Guard, and the Office of Naval Intelligence. And of note, she also served as president of INSA from 2008 to 2012. Ellen is an outstanding IC leader and someone who I'm proud to call my friend and colleague. Please join me in welcoming the Honorable Ellen McCarthy.
Thank you, John. Thanks for that great introduction. I owe you a bottle of wine later, okay?
Yeah, I'll take you up on that.
Thank you, INSA, for asking me to come moderate this panel. I'll tell you, when it comes to policy, people, and culture, that's my favorite subject. Culture will eat strategy for lunch, dinner, breakfast, whatever. So, and John, thank you for your keynote. I'll tell you, it's a perfect segue to our discussion today. I mean, I think you went through the history of how long the IC has been grappling with open source. I mean, heck, it goes back to Winston Churchill. But for me, it really resonated around the time of Arab Spring and how are we leveraging social media. But you know, they say timing is everything. And so I think our timing right now for this topic is absolutely perfect. John, you went into great detail about what your team at CSIS did in terms of that study that was just published, and particularly the part about open source intelligence and how the DNI, who also is a part of your team, really needs to look at it as a component maybe equal to HUMINT, SIGINT, or GEOINT. You've also got Congress engaged on open source right now. The 21 Intel Authorization Act actually asks the DNI to look more closely at open source and the value it provides intelligence. But I'll tell you, really, I think in some ways, COVID and the pandemic really is also a case of where timing is everything. And actually, Fran, your last question I thought was right on, which is, you know, really is COVID and the fact that we had so many agencies and analysts who were sitting at home. Is that really a chance to sort of push the envelope to leverage open source more? You know, I'll take advantage of my time at INR. I mean, we have 200 analysts sitting at home, and during this time, we actually produced a whole new line of intelligence reporting called the commentary. We produced 400 of these articles. They were unclassified articles, and I will tell you they were received with great enthusiasm. And I think mostly it was because we just had people who operate at that level who were just dying to get insights from our analysts and other analysts across the IC. So I think COVID is actually playing a role in how we're looking at this discussion. Of course, there are a lot of challenges, and again, John, you highlighted almost all of them to incorporating open source into the community. You talked about organizational restructuring, of course, there's the resources that need to be reallocated, and then the big question of how do you manage it? Is it centrally managed or is it via the individual elements? I don't think we're going to go into that as much today. Really, today is about, I think, the hardest part, and that really is the people. And when I say people, that's the policy piece and culture. And we have an incredible group of folks here today who are going to help us focus on that part of the discussion. So here today, representing the intelligence community's all source intelligence components, we have Brad Alskog, who's the chief of OSINT integration at the Defense Intelligence Agency. We have Mr. Daniel Flaherty, who's the sanctions coordinator from the Bureau of Intelligence and Research. Representing the private sector, all source intelligence capabilities, we have Dr. James Mulvenin, who's here from SOS International. Today, representing the law enforcement component of the intelligence community, we have Ryan Young, who's the Assistant Director of Intelligence at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And keeping most of these folks out of jail, and we're very grateful for that, by the way, we have Mr. Ben Hubner, who's the Chief Civil Liberties and Privacy and Transparency Officer from the Office of DNI. So gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us today. So just to set expectations, we've got about 25 minutes where I get to ask questions, and then we're going to open up questions to the audience. I've spoken with all of you. We warmed up for this. I'd ask that you keep your answers to about 2 minutes so that we can really, there's so many areas that we can delve into. So let's keep our answers pithy but on point, and let's go ahead and get started. So my first question will go to Brad, Daniel, and Ryan. We'll start with Brad. How can we better incorporate open source into the intelligence community, and how should we use it, and when should we use it, and how can we trust it? Brad? Okay, we're not going to let technology get in our way. Let's jump to Daniel.
Thanks, Ellen. It's great to be here. And thanks to INSA as well for inviting me. I just wanted to take a few seconds and kind of reiterate what we've heard already a lot, which is the essential value that OSINT provides to all source analysis. I was an all source analyst for a number of years, and I can promise you that I didn't produce one single paper that didn't have open sources backing it up, supporting it, informing it. And so I can't be a bigger proponent of open sources. And also from the sanctions perspective, which is just what I've fallen into in the last few years, once again, we cannot possibly imagine effective sanctions policy or intelligence support to sanctions without OSINT. It is absolutely critical to keeping our sanctions business going, whether it's identifying targets, enforcing sanctions, making changes to our sanctions policy, impact of sanctions across the board. So I just wanted to put that out there. Now, to answer your question very briefly, how should we use it? The answer, short for me, is carefully and routinely. And then when should we use it? The answer is all the time. That's it. I mean, and I can go on at this, longer later on. And how should we better incorporate it into the IC? I'll make one point there, and it's largely from the sort of economic security threat finance perspective, which is we're only just beginning, to my mind, to really understand and get on top of the big data, the commercial databases and that sort of thing that were referred to earlier. And that sort of information, commercial databases and other open sources, I really don't think that we have gotten on top of yet. So I think making those more accessible to IC analysts across the board and making the analysts, especially the all source ones, actually use it, I think is something that we need to do to better incorporate it into the IC. And I'll stop there.
Great. Thanks. Brian.
Hey, thanks for having me, Ellen, and thanks everybody for logging in and taking the time to listen to us. I'll hit it right early. I was going to say, definitely want to echo a lot of what Daniel said. For us, it is a great start. And, you know, how much can you know about an adversary? How much can you know about a country? How much can you love that, or, you know, compared to what you know in the SIGINT, GEOINT, or the HUMINT world? Is it matching what you're seeing? The FBI, we're a little bit different. We do partner with the IC members, and we do utilize our open source in many of the same mechanisms that the IC uses, but we also have a line that we kind of, you know, border on with the law enforcement. And so one of the challenges that we have is, can it be verified? Some of our stuff is going to be testimonial, and you know, if it is going to be testimonial, how do we get it? How can we attribute it? And how can we corroborate it? So definitely one of the challenges that we use, I mean, is in hitting what John McLaughlin said, it has become exponential. We need to find better ways to aggregate that data utilizing technology, and that's one of the challenges that we're constantly doing. How can we get the best information? How can we know what we need to do? How can we know as much as publicly available on a topic? And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Ellen.
Great, thanks, Ryan. Okay, James, so you look at all source from the private sector side. So your question, how is the private sector leveraging open source information? What lessons can be taken from the private sector? Do similar cultural biases, presuming they exist, which I think we would agree they do, outside of the government?
So the private sector, you know, I would divide the private sector into the large scale English language, big data that Daniel was talking about. I think we do a good job of incorporating that. That's the sort of LexisNexis's, Thomson Reuters, and they're deeply integrated into the IC, and they have a role. You know, my area of expertise is a Chinese linguist, and someone who's been providing Chinese and Russian and Iranian data to the IC and DoD and federal law enforcement for a long time, is specifically the challenges we have in that area. And there we're not doing very well. And there's a huge divergence between what's actually available. Keep in mind that surveillance societies have another side to them, which is that they are very information rich. You know, there are millions of badly protected online network cameras in China. There are gigantic surveillance databases sitting unprotected in Elasticsearch on Ali Cloud and Huawei Cloud and things like that. So, you know, this idea that these societies are totally locked down is actually quite wrong. But there's a lot of tradecraft associated with getting to that data, and it's becoming increasingly difficult with the advent of two-factor authentication and Face ID and things like that. You know, in just over the course of my career, going from a time when you could fly to Beijing looking like this, you know, and this doesn't happen in 5 minutes, Ellen, and, you know, getting off an airplane and going to 24 Chinese military bookstores and buying hundreds of books written by active duty military officers, you know, those days are just simply gone. I mean, that was the heyday of my youth when I was working at RAND. It's much more difficult to get them. And these societies are becoming much more understanding that people are collecting this material. So the tradecraft requirements are going up. And I think unfortunately, the IC is uniquely badly positioned to be able to get to a lot of this material, principally post-Snowden, because of the extent to which it closed its own sphincters in terms of being able to get to that kind of material from inside the skiff. And so there is a partnership, though, and I'll just close with this, which is there's a lot of new and interesting mechanisms by which, you know, organizations like mine that are inside the circle of trust but still connected to the outside are either finding new ways of pushing this data and the application layer up into IC Cloud and other things that makes them usable, or even newer models whereby you get around some of the data privacy issues and the 12333 issues and things like that. Keep in mind, we are going to have a federal data privacy law probably this year, synchronized with GDPR, and that's going to really complicate a lot of issues. Of the IC being able to do query in place against the data on my premise. And so I have all the legal liability for minimization and everything else. And so there are some really interesting new models about how we're going to do this.
Thanks, James. You know, Ben, this is the perfect time then to pull you into the discussion, so thank you for the setup. So James, how do privacy rights and civil liberties factor into open source collection, especially in relation to social media? This is a three-part question. What work is the ODNI doing on this front? And how do private companies consider privacy issues when acquiring and analyzing open source data?
So first off, thank you very much for having me. I'm going to try to do that quickly, but it is going to be difficult. It is a thicket of civil liberties, as John correctly said.
Not here. We'll give you another 2 minutes.
Well, there you go. I mean, I think the first question to think about here is, very briefly, some folks might think that you really wouldn't have too many privacy and civil liberties issues with publicly available information. And for some types of publicly available information, that's true. And for others, it's definitely not. And it's good to remind ourselves that when we think back to our current oversight structure, our authorities that came out of the experience of the 1970s, some of the abuses before were OSINT abuses, right? You know, when you were out there collecting news clippings about Vietnam protesters, that was OSINT, right? When you were looking at who was attending a particular civil rights protest, that was OSINT as well. And so, not surprisingly, our legal regime, our privacy and civil liberties protections do extend to publicly available information, and they do so in a couple of different ways. Really critically in this space is under the Privacy Act. For government, under E7, we cannot collect or maintain or disseminate records that are about someone's First Amendment activities, with some limited exceptions, and Ryan right there has one of those exceptions for law enforcement investigations. But that's a real sort of key piece when you think of something like the January 6th insurrection, right? It is definitely the case that people can think two things simultaneously. One, how could you possibly not see something like that? It was planned publicly. And two, how dare you look at my postings about some political issue of interest, right? We as Americans, and that is not a criticism, but we as Americans hold both of those concepts in our mind at the same time. And that's the sort of area that we're trying to navigate. So how do we do that? And what is the DNI doing in that area? First off, publicly available information, OSINT, is critical. And so we have set up our procedures, our protections, to first recognize that in many cases, there are diminished concerns with publicly available information. And first, we need to define what that is, right? So we have created now a common definition across the intelligence community about what we even mean when we say publicly available information. Now it's critical to do a lot of information sharing. We've also made it very clear that there are certain things that we are never allowed to do, right? We are never allowed to collect information solely based on First Amendment activities. And then the question becomes, what are the right types of protection? And that really goes to two things. First is making sure that regardless of the type of data that you're collecting, that you're scoping that collection with respect to that authorized purpose. It used to be the case that we felt relatively safer in the privacy and civility sphere when we could say, well, we're just foreign focused. But if we look at these large data sets, and particularly the way data travels around the globe, it just isn't true anymore that in a lot of cases, that because a data set was collected abroad, that doesn't have any US person's information in it. And so what we've done with our US person protections is say, we need to be thinking about this across the entire data lifecycle, right? We need to be scoping that collection at the front end, but the fact that we scope it and when we can filter it, that doesn't mean that we are done, right? We're going to assume there was some US person information in there, and we're going to think about that as we determine how are we going to analyze it. The AI ML discussion is very relevant to this. How long are we going to retain it? What information are we going to disseminate it? And we're going to realize that the reasonableness of our protections is not looking at one of those things, but looking at sort of the full scope of them and across that entire life cycle. That's going to give us the greatest ability to use this information while also giving us the sort of strongest protections on the privacy and civil liberties sphere.
Okay. Ellen, could I make just a two finger on that, just which I think is an important embellishment to what he said. I actually, as a private sector person, I should have mentioned this when you asked about private sector. As you know, under this new distinction between OSINT and PAI, very rarely have OSINT authorities because they require Title 50 authorities. And some of my wise and generous customers extend their Title 50 authorities to what we're doing. But I've had to sort of purge, and this is for all the INSA members on the call. I've had to purge the phrase OSINT out of my corporate leadership's mind and say, please, say publicly available information. Otherwise, the lawyers will descend in helicopters on our corporate headquarters. The other issue that is somewhat from the John McLaughlin days, somewhat different, is, and this is the main problem that OSE has had, is royalties. You know, the pesky Chinese communists in their state media are defending the royalties of their publications. And that caused that historic break that was so important to the US government between academia and the US government to collaborate during the Cold War, because FIBUS could share Soviet press with them, and then we could all crowdsource the analysis of it. The reason why opensource.gov, may it rest in peace, had to be FOUO was precisely because the communists and other foreigners were actually defending their intellectual property rights on their material, and we could no longer share it with non-contractor, non-government personnel. And so that has been a fundamental schism, I think, that really in many ways broke some of the most powerful open source exploitation capabilities and collaborations that the US government historically had.
Great, thanks, James. Anybody have anything to add to the privacy, Ryan? Or I know you walk that line between IC, law enforcement.
Yeah, that's actually definitely a challenge, and Ben said it really well. I mean, even we often have kind of like challenges when we talk about it internally, even with the lawyers, like, you know, the talk of why is this any different than walking down the street and looking left and right, and if you see something, you can go take a deeper look. I think where we really, and this is kind of the define, and really, you know, we talk SOMEX, social media exploitation. That's really where we see our challenges, going back to what we see kind of January 6th, what we saw kind of through the summer is, listen, it's okay to have your First Amendment right. I mean, you should have your First Amendment rights. You should be able to speak. You know, there's a fine line between, you know, freedom and security. But with that, where our challenge is, and it is in the medium, is where's the violence? I mean, that is really the great, you know, divide. And that's what we are actually looking for. And so, you know, Ben said it great. I mean, that is actually in our policy, authorized purpose. We can take an event like prior to January 6th, and there's going to be an event. We can open up an assessment. We have an authorized purpose to look in that. 56 field offices, people that do open source, not only at headquarters, but in the field. And with that, they could be looking for where they would find that information, or where the, you know, the different forums or the different applications that would, you know, tell us that there is something planned. But really, even then, just that we know that doesn't make that the threat. The threat is the threat of violence. And so, you know, it is challenging. We will see with the legislation right now, but a lot of, like when I say back, looking at what we do domestically with US persons, retention, being able to look at that is going to be a hot topic. And we are going to see where that goes. I think January 6th is going to emanate for a long time. But really, that is where our challenge is. And like I said, it is that authorized purpose. But you can have your First Amendment, it's the violence. And so when you pair the violence with that, that's when we can predicate an investigation and use the tools that would bring that to mitigate that threat.
Okay. Ben, is there any policies that we haven't touched upon yet? I know we've talked about some of the legal constraints, but are there any policies, and if not, then we can just move on to the next question, that are in place that might affect the acquisition, the retention, the use of PAI pertaining to US citizens?
So I definitely think, so each of the IC elements has, you know, what are referred to lovingly sometimes as the Attorney General guidelines, right? Under EO 12333, those core sets of procedures, and back when I was a young attorney at the Department of Justice and I was teaching people at DOJ about the FBI, I used to say that those Attorney General guidelines and the dialogue, if you understood those, that was in many ways the only way to understand the FBI. And that's true across the IC. Our US person protections are very much baked in. I think, so you heard at her confirmation hearing that Dina and I talk about commercially available information. And I think that is an area where we need to give some more thought about what the right framework is. You know, the types of data, and you heard John talk about this a lot, the types of data that are available now vastly exceed, you know, what you could read in the New York Times. And I think that is an area where we realize that some of that data is not very sensitive at all. And some of it is incredibly sensitive, and we don't treat the two at the same, but I think there's some room there for some additional policy for how can we as an IC in a more uniform way think through both the sensitivities and the controls we put on it to mitigate some of those issues.
Yeah,
This is
Daniel,
Brad.
knowing what you do, Daniel, that I mean, that absolutely has to be looked at because so much of what you do requires those sorts of insights.
Yeah, this is Brad. Hopefully everyone can hear me now and see me. I'd just like to add in, my perspective as a, practitioner and leader trying to, move this discipline forward to bring it to, the same par as the other, more utilized intelligence disciplines. And, one of the things that, Ben, you mentioned struck me is very important, and I've already experienced it here in my tenure at DI working open source issues, and that's that, we do come across sources of data that require more handling or more sensitive because of both the volume and the volume of potential USPI. And we already are moving sort of above the Attorney General guidelines that exist for all OSINT, and we have to treat it differently. So I want to hammer home that point you made that, especially with the information environment, not just of today, but in 5 years, we're going to have to be very sophisticated about how we protect U.S. persons' information, we're going to have to change how we think about it to some aspect, and how we make sure that we are, continuing the ironclad protection of U.S. citizens and persons' information that we're all obligated to in the intelligence community. So I can't stop enough the importance of us, thinking from a creation of a new policy, new procedures perspective, and basically having dedicated professionals who are the experts and understand these complex issues, be the ones who are really handling this data, and also, making sure that the algorithms and other automation technologies that are involved here are configured the right way. So we have to do a lot more than we're doing now, in my opinion, and I think it's going to be extremely important for the future of open source in the IC. Over.
So Brad, your time, I opened with timing is everything, and your timing was absolutely perfect. So thank you for that. I'm going to ask one more question before we open up to the audience. And this question is going to be directed to Daniel and Ryan. So what are the roots? And Brad, actually, I'd be interested in your take on this as well. So I'll send this to Daniel, Ryan, and Brad. What are the roots of the IC's cultural bias against open source collection and analysis, and what should the IC do to make open source intelligence more central to the IC's work? Let's start with you, Daniel.
Thanks, Ellen. I thought about this question a lot, and yeah, there are biases, that's for sure. And I just want to touch on two of them, perhaps. One is resources, and the other is what I would refer to as a sort of a superiority complex. By resources, what I mean is that we spend a lot of money collecting, reporting from a variety of channels, in a variety of channels and that sort of thing. We spend a lot of time and effort doing this. And I think that over many years, that just sort of creates a sort of a pressure, a natural pressure to depend on this information that we've spent so much time, energy, and money acquiring. So, and I think that has benefited certain ints and perhaps has kind of act as a bias against open source. So that's the resources part. The superiority complex, what I mean by that is that I think it's fair to say that there is the belief among some or many in the IC that if we collect it secretly, it's better, it's more accurate, it's truthful. We can't be as trustworthy of open sources as we can, the stuff we've collected secretly. So I think that is also a big factor for many all source analysts and others in the IC. I think that definitely colors their views, and it's a bias that we should work to address. Thanks.
Yeah, I was gonna say I'd echo a lot of what Daniel said. I think we definitely have a great belief and we push and kind of illuminate our open source training across our disciplines. And we do it not only with our intelligence analysts, but our tactical specialists, special agents, actually even some of the, our linguists as well. with that, going back what I said earlier is it's the attribution for us. A lot of stuff is going to be testimonial. It is when we get stuff clandestinely or we get through your human or SIGINT, it's much easier to attribute it and well as kind of corroborate it. It's easier to show up in court. But that being said, there is a basis with open source that we have used in courtrooms as well. But I think that would be my points on it. And like I said, just going back, the way that we get stuff through legal process is also a stamp of authenticity that we don't always have with stuff that we collect through the open source channels.
Thanks, Ryan. Brad, can you comment on any, from your vantage point of DIA, what are there cultural biases against open source collection and analysis, and what should the IC do?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So I certainly have seen those biases throughout my career in the intelligence community. And I think part of it is if OSINT is something that anyone and everyone can do, irrespective of your discipline, then everyone just sort of treats it as the thing that's out there, not its own discrete, unique thing that requires specialized training and tradecraft. And I think that has presented challenges in making it, a more credible source in some cases. I think we're moving in the right direction as a community when we think about developing, better training and tradecraft, professionalization, and other things. And when you look at the value of an open source piece of open source information, it should be treated just like any other source of information. It should be evaluated based on the other potentially corroborating sources. You should have confidence levels in the veracity and accuracy of the information, and it should be caveated appropriately, just like you would any other source. So I think it's a cultural issue as well as a professionalization issue of OSINT as a int that's equal to the other one. So I think it's going to take some time, but I think everyone generally in the community that I know seem to recognize we've got to do more and think of it more as a int at some, to some degree, and we're moving in the right direction.
Great, thanks, Brad. Any other comments before I start addressing some of the audience questions?
I'll only tell you, as a provider of open source intelligence to the intelligence community, that it is often met with a great deal of skepticism, and we had to develop strategies along the way, not the least of which was if you do like a really detailed targeting package on a hypersonic glide vehicle engineer and the ops people don't care, and then you call somebody at NSA and you put it up in collect, and then you staple a couple of SIGINT reports to about it that just basically verifies what you told them the first time, it magically now has more importance to those people than it did when you gave it to them the first time. And so it's a pathology. I would actually use the word fetishization of classified material, and I agree that it's because of the way we collect it, but it's also the special feature. And just the cosmic comment would be, as we live in a world of finite resources, letting the IC do what it does best in terms of clandestine collection and the things it has the authorities for, and then allowing the private sector to do what they have comparative advantages. 1 + 1 can equal 3. We just haven't been able to figure out how to do that fusion, rather than forcing the government to do something it's not good at and not postured to do in many cases, or telling the private sector that they don't have the authorities to do X, Y, or Z. So.
Well, before jumping to the audience, I wish we had a Coast Guard person here, because I'll tell you that, like INR, some of the smaller intel elements, for their whole existence, INR going back to the 40s, has had to leverage whatever they could get. And more often than not, it was publicly available information. So as a result, they're steeped, they're used to it. They've worked with it. That's all they had. So it's where their user base resides. So it's not as tough a transition for some of the smallers or those who sort of walk that line, FBI, between law enforcement and intel. So at this point, thank you for letting me take advantage of my moderator position here to answer a question. But okay, turning to the audience. This question is addressed to Brad, Ryan, and Ben. Does the IC consider information available for purchase through a commercial company to be open source information? And what constraints, if any, are placed on such data?
So I guess I will start. I will give you, I'm in a policy position now, but I am a lawyer, so I'll give you the lawyer's answer, and the lawyer's answer is sometimes. So when there are certain types of commercially available information that are considered to be publicly available, and this is going to sound a little circular, but the question is, can the public buy it, right? Is it available for any buyer to come in, or do I have to be positioned as a government in order to purchase the information? Both of those are commercially available information. One of those is publicly available information, and the difference matters because when you look at the protections that we put on the information, if it is information that can be purchased by anyone in the public, that type of information, there are longer retention periods associated with it. There's a broader ability to disseminate that type of information, and you still have the questions about whether we can collect it in the first place, but that applies to every int and every type of collection. When you are talking about commercially available information that is only available to the government, we may be able to purchase it, we may not, but we will put greater protections on that type of information because it is considered to likely have greater privacy and civil liberties implications.
Thanks, Ben. Brad, Ryan, anything to add?
Yeah, this is Brad. I would certainly echo everything Ben said. And because OSINT really, never grew up like some of the other ents, it just sort of always have been happening in a sort of a disaggregated fashion throughout the community. There still is a lot of work to do on basic definitions and lexicon. And what is a definition of open source? What is OSINT? What is PAI? And so I think you're seeing across the community a pretty healthy and important discussion to sort of come to some consensus with the realization that we've got to sort something out that really hasn't been fully sorted out. The world has changed and is changing rapidly, so we've got to adapt to the voluminous flow of information that we can either acquire publicly, or we can potentially purchase. So it's an important topic, and I think there's a lot more work to be done on it.
I would say, Ellen, I'd echo a lot. Ben really laid it out, that legal foundation. I would say for us, we do get offered a lot of, information from the private sector. It is a lot of challenges legally. There's stuff that we would like to do, certain companies monetize certain information. We know those are vulnerabilities that we could act upon if we had that information, but it still is legally in between where we would have that First Amendment protected speech or activities. And I think those are the challenges. We are still going through the legal process to get much of that information, especially what we'd say with ad tech and some of the other stuff out there. But like I said, we do know that there's information out there that would make our job easier, but is there the appetite for that? And in depending on what happens at a certain time, that pendulum swings back and forth. I was gonna say, years ago, I'm gonna date myself at after 9/11, we did not have very many FISAs up. I mean, it was easier to get certain FISAs, but the ones on US persons, the ones acting as agents of foreign government were hard to get by. The pendulum swung the other way after 9/11, but as we saw recently in the last couple of years, the pendulum swung back the other way. They want to make sure that, are we on the right targets? Do we have the predication? Do we have the purpose to be, infringing on somebody's First Amendment rights? So Ben gave you the better legal answer. I'll kind of give you what, how we work upon in those investigations and what, is expected or allowed with the public and the administration and justice as well.
And Ryan makes a really important point there because we start with the law, but we don't end with the law. And we need to recognize that in this information space that we exist in, this is not just about the intelligence community figuring out what's the appropriate use of this data. You heard James talking about a potential federal privacy law. We are figuring this out as a federal government, but we are actually figuring this out as a society. Twitter is not that old. And we are really rethinking what we think the right role of government is in this space and what the right role of the private sector is in this space. And so it's what makes this an exceedingly interesting field.
You know, I wish, and so we should do another session on this, which is really about the change in society and the fact that we are more transparent, we are more open, there are more expectations, or there's not a presumption of privacy like there was back even pre 9/11. And Brian, there's so much more data now since there was. I mean, heck, I started the Soviet Union was, you know, our biggest issue, and
exactly. And I think even with us, we challenge, you know, the challenge right now, we also have lawful access. Well, even where we can go get a court order, you know, some of those private sector companies have set up their applications or their messaging systems to be encrypted. So even if we had a kidnapped child where the father says, hey, you have the right to get into this phone, likely could save the life of that child, you know, the companies have built their stuff a certain way that they do not want us to have that encryption. They don't want the back door, and they've, you know, made it that way. So, you know, even on the open source, even on legal challenges, we still have difficulty.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about how many Intel failures I've certainly heard about in my time, and that weren't really Intel failures. It was all the things we're talking about right now, our inability to get to that kind of data for all the right reasons. So.
Yeah, and Ellen, one more brief thing, just because Ryan mentioned ad tech. There's also exogenous variables. I mean, Congress is slowly but surely coming up on changing the laws related to that. I mean, ad tech and those things were the it girl in the IC for the last couple of years, like Mace and everything else. And you know, before the January 6th event, I would have said that's going to go away. You know, we're gonna, the Supreme Court's finally gonna, you know, enjoin everything on geolocation with mobile phones, and we're gonna get that sorted out. Now, given the value of it, of geofencing around the Capitol, now you can make an argument that says actually it was really important. And so maybe the tide is shifting in the other direction. But Congress and Ron Wyden and those guys are bound and determined to put out legislation restricting the ability for us to do what we've been doing with ad tech and mobile geolocation data. And so, you know, I would anticipate that we're going to have a very tough discussion about that this year.
Thanks, James. Okay, next question. I'll throw it out to the whole panel. So how do our adversaries make use of OSINT available in the United States? For example, property records, tax data from a town hosting a military base. What can we do to limit adversaries' access to such information?
Yeah, this is Brad. I'll start. You know, so I look at it from another way. How can we know that's out there about us, so we can understand what they potentially can be using it for? And so I think that's important for us to understand our own environment in our own country at some level, you know, not an intrusive level, but we have to start with seeing, you know, learning a little bit about, you know, what's available in our own backyard and what we're doing, and then we can make more informed, you know, assessments about what they may be doing, and then, you know, look at other sources to help illuminate that. But I think it's critical that we maintain some level of access and understanding to the broader information technology and telecommunications environment around the world, so we can better defend and prepare to defend against, you know, large efforts that, you know, that our adversaries or competitors or other nations can choose to use against us. So I think as an open society, we're particularly vulnerable, and we need to really understand what our vulnerabilities are.
Right. I mean, Ellen, the book I wrote a number of years ago with 2 officers from CIA on Chinese industrial espionage, actually, the majority of the book was on non-traditional collection against US open source. A perfect example, we're all familiar with the Defense Technical Information Center over on Port Royal here in Northern Virginia. One of the largest customers of DTIC every year is the S&T counselor at the PRC Embassy, who buys 4 million pages of microfiche a year from DoD's open source information center. And so, you know, obviously as an open society, we're not going to change that about our nature, but we certainly can move to a posture where the meta tagging and things that we do on the data, that we know where it's going, and that we could do a much better job of understanding those networks of collection, such that we could then do real assessments of levels of knowledge. Because when you pair that information with what the Chinese took in OPM and Care First Blue Cross Blue Shield and Anthem and everything, you have, you know, what General Hayden and others have called the most incredible human targeting database in human history. And the only good news I ever give people about that is remember that most of those SF-86s that were exfilled out of OPM were back in the old days when we would handwrite them. And so there's some poor bastard in Beijing who was told, take all of this handwritten data and make it structured data and put it in a database. I mean, can you imagine what a nightmare that would be? So that's the only good news I've ever been able to find about that story.
Thanks, James. Actually, this just gets me as we're thinking about Senator Wyden's bill. I hope that's being considered, that while the government may not be able to get access to that data, who else is buying that data from those companies, and
right.
What is it doing to it?
Ellen, is definitely in our world and with our partnerships in the IC, we look at this as what we call ubiquitous technical surveillance. And so those vulnerabilities that we have to have out there, and there's different vectors. You got the CCTV, you got finances, you got everybody has a social media profile, your travel. So all those things that we put out in our digital exhaust can be used against us, just like we use it against our adversaries. So understanding those vulnerabilities, better training on the front end, understanding, there's mistakes that we can make. I was gonna say, so we go back to our bread and butter is sources and wires. We can taint a source, initially for years down the road just by having phone calls from certain landlines that could then be exploited against us. So understanding those vectors, understanding those vulnerabilities, understanding that how we get after our adversaries, it's likely coming back to us in the same way. And it's for us having that challenge domestically, our folks in the IC that are already on ground that they don't control is even making them more vulnerable.
Thanks, Ryan. In regard to print, digital, and social media, how can an analyst trust the source when so much out there can often be politicized?
This is Brad. I'll take that again first. I really think it comes down to having a trained individual who sort of knows what's out there, is familiar with the different open sources, has a sort of pattern of life view of what these sources have been saying over time. And I think if you have a structured, consistent approach by trained experts, they will be able to detect potential disinformation or things that may not, equate to reality, and they will be able to compare it to other sources of information. So I think it takes really skill and training and commitment to having the people assigned to do that function. Oh.
Yeah, and to be honest, that's yet another one of our lost relics, Alan, which is, FBIS and OSC used to do very detailed media analyses of Chinese and Russian media outlets and putting them on, sort of graphs to show where they were politically and what their reliability was and things like that. And with the disappearance of those kinds of foundational documents, and the dissemination of them, that collective knowledge is being lost. And instead, we live in a world where, as some people like to waggishly say, everyone has their own truth, and there's the subjective aspect of truth, and everyone on Twitter, has their own expertise and everything like that. And so, if anything, the community needs to reestablish those thresholds and those boundaries and say, no, I've been looking at people's daily for the last 10 years, and this is what we would expect, and this is what this kind of editorial means, and so on and so forth. And that's something we need to get back to. That's gone.
James, it's not dead. So again, I go back to INR and the commentary back after COVID hit. We produced, heck, I think they're up to 500 or 600 of them right now, and they really are media analysis, and it goes back to the old FIBIS days. But when you have analysts who've been looking at something for 17, 18, 19, 100 years, speak 5 languages, and have been trained and trained to recognize tradecraft vulnerabilities, we can still do it. So training is key.
I mean, your pride in INR is well placed, okay? But INR is also a relatively small organization, and this is a scale issue. When you look at the amount of digital media that is simply coming out of the PRC, it is beyond the capacity of even a highly trained organization.
James, you introduce the right technology and you take just a small group of analysts, and it's amazing what you can do.
No, I wouldn't know anything about that.
Yes, you would. Any other responses to training? I think training really is critical here.
Yeah, Ellen, this is Dan. I think we're not very good on training at the State Department when it comes to open sources and that sort of thing. When I became an analyst, I learned it as I went. No one swooped in and said, here's a week-long course at the Foreign Service Institute or some other place. It just didn't happen that way. And we had to learn how to read open sources just like every other source of information out there. So I would definitely say that going forward, there should be more consideration and thought given to how to institute some actual training to get folks, able to handle this information, process it, and think about it, so that they know what they can trust and what they can't, and how to corroborate using other sources and that sort of thing. And but you talked about like print and digital media. It came up as a question, and say, in my business, in the sanctions business, when you have, the now deceased, IRGC commander Soleimani getting off of an airplane in Baghdad, and a soldier on the ground snapping a picture, a selfie with him, and then posting it online, that's pretty convincing. And I think that that's information that is quite good, and an example of where OSINT goes where many ints don't.
Great, thanks. All right, we'll move on to the next question. Thanks, Daniel. I love this question. So with more government leaders and members of Congress, as Mr. McLaughlin mentioned, having access to open source data and analysis from a variety of sources through the news, social media, non-governmental organizations, etc., how has the IC changed the way it provides or interacts with decision makers and policy implementers? Has it changed, or should it change? How do they counter information that may not necessarily be verified or corroborated by classified sources? Love this question. Don't make me answer it.
Yeah, this is Brad, Ellen. I'll jump in here. So I think at the end of the day, it's about customer engagement and building trust that the product and views that we provide as intelligence professionals should be relied upon versus all the other stuff that's out there, right, that may or may not be accurate. And so I think it comes down to maintaining our credibility and trust with our customers, and also on occasion commenting on an open source. So if we see something out there that is particularly relevant to a major policy issue, maybe we need to produce a competing assessment or product that provides our commentary or alternative view on that same information. And so we've got to be very agile as we think about when we jump in and do that. But it all comes down to our value proposition as intelligence professionals, and maintaining that, and that constant back and forth communication with our customers. Over.
Thanks,
I'd
Brad.
just think, on the FBI side, I know we have a lot more engagement than we used to, and I think that actually pays a lot of dividends. We share a lot more intelligence than we used to as well. They are better at understanding the threats, the actors, and we need to make sure that they understand the vulnerabilities and the U.S. equities. So we've been very, very forward-leaning about having meetings at the highest level with the director, as well as our operational division leaders with folks in those committees. And like I said, it's going to continue to be a challenge, but I was going to say, I think engagement is our best effort.
Okay, Ben, this question's for you. Do the laws or policies on publicly available information change if the government purchases the data from industry instead of collecting it themselves?
So it was a complicated answer. At some level, no, right? And one of the things that has been sort of a hallmark of what we've been trying to do with the U.S. person protections is to say, while collection is incredibly important, and we need to think carefully through that. Once we get past that threshold and then have the data, then the data is the data is the data, and the sensitivity of it is the same. If Ryan gets some information from a source and Dan purchases it, and NSA gets it from SIGINT, but it's literally the same file, then it's literally the same file. And in terms of what the protections are for how long we retain it and disseminate it, it really should fundamentally be the same answer. And it should be derived from the underlying sensitivity of the information. I think where it gets more complex and where I think we have some real thought to do is, we certainly won't task private industry to do something that we legally can't do either. But I think there are some interesting questions with respect to what I started off with my comments, which is under the Privacy Act, under E7, we can't maintain records about someone's First Amendment about an individual's First Amendment activity. But there's sort of interesting questions in terms of trends that you would get from looking at a lot of individuals, which we can't have, but which would be useful to know at a sort of anonymized level, right? Are we seeing trends showing a certain type of radicalization in a certain part of the world? When it's a certain part of the world, that's often something that we can do. When it's here in the United States, it gets a lot more dicey. And so I do think there are some instances where if an academic institution or private industry comes and says, okay, we have done some form of, still lawful, it still has to be lawful collection, we're not going to tell you the views of individuals, but we are going to tell you our findings, and we're going to give you some of the basis for understanding those findings. There is probably some space there to do things that the government itself, it would be much more difficult to do.
Great, thanks, Ben. Okay, we've got a couple of minutes left. Gentlemen, have there been any questions? Was there a question that you wanted to ask that hasn't been asked yet? Anything you wish you had gotten to that we just haven't gotten to?
I would just point out that having been in this business for about 25 years, I don't think there's ever been a greater divergence between the US government and intelligence community's rhetoric about the importance of open source and the actual resourcing devoted to it. There's a lot of lip service paid to how important it is. But as someone who has worked with open source enterprise, for instance, for a long time, that organization has, suffered a lot of bureaucratic degradation, and so where is the problem? And I agree with Mr. McLaughlin. It's in the wrong place. It has the wrong masters. It is not cared for where it is. And one of the things that's been most exciting about the emergence of Brad's organization is also the lack of legacy and all of the sort of ties that bind, and the idea that you can sort of take a fresh look at things and not be sort of bound by, as OSE was for many years, by all their brick and mortar facilities overseas that they got rid of and things like that, which were just huge overhead impediments to innovation and things along those lines. But I will say, as someone who spends his time trying to convince people to expend resources on this, I have been struck by the divergence.
Any other comments, questions that weren't asked that you wish had been? Any follow-up to James? Okay.
I thought that Mr. McLaughlin's comments about what was considered where open source should be, should it be its own thing? I thought those were very interesting and provocative. I'm at the State Department. I would not put the open source enterprise at the State Department. I just wouldn't do that. How about a satellite office? I think that works. I do like the idea of it being an independent agency, under the DNI, given the importance of it. I think that works great. I like that idea a lot, but I would not put it at the State Department. And the other point I would make, just very briefly, is we've talked a lot about the US angle to open sources, privacy information, and that sort of thing. I think it's very important as well to keep in mind the foreign policy aspect of open source information and how important it is. Especially now where we're sort of in a process of trying to rebuild some relationships and that sort of thing, strengthen ties that might have been damaged over the recent years and that sort of thing. One critical way that we do that is through information sharing, and open source has an invaluable role to play there.
Thanks, Daniel, and thank you for bringing in the foreign partner piece because that definitely came up. So I see Suzanne up, but I just want to thank everybody. And I'll tell you that I don't think, having served in the intelligence community, that while there's a cultural component to this, I think every officer in the intelligence community understands the value of open source. It's how it gets communicated, it's how it gets trained, it's how expectations are set for these fine analysts and collectors within the IC. And I wish the new DNI and the new team great success. I would recommend that they look at INR a little more closely because I think INR does a great job of leveraging open source, just needs a little more focus. And with that, Suzanne, thank you for the opportunity. Thank you, gentlemen, for being able to participate with y'all today.
Well, Ellen, thank you for joining us this afternoon. I know open source is a passion of yours, and you did a great job moderating. Ben, Brad, Daniel, James, and Ryan, want to thank each of you for joining us this afternoon as well. And I'd also like to once again thank our sponsors. Their support ensures that we can deliver this type of premium content and candid insights. If you were late to this afternoon's program, once again, I'll mention that it will be available on our website on Monday, as well as tomorrow's program as well. And that is courtesy of our digital playback sponsor, GDIT. Looking ahead, tomorrow at 2, Major General Kate Leahy, the U.S. Army's Assistant G2, will open the symposium's second day with keynote remarks on the Army's use of OSINT. She will be followed by a rockstar panel discussion on emerging OSINT technologies. This panel will be moderated by INSA's Senior Advisor and former Principal Deputy DNI, Sue Gordon. I expect this to be a lively conversation, just as the conversations have been today. And when today's session ends, you'll see a short survey pop up. Please take a few moments to complete us and let us know how we did. This concludes today's program. Stay safe and healthy and have a wonderful day. And we'll look forward to seeing you all tomorrow at 2 o'clock Eastern time. Good afternoon.